I died for 6 minutes in 2003. Heaven isn't what we think it is. In 2003, when I was 15 years old, my heart stopped for 6 minutes. It happened on an ordinary afternoon, at the point in my daily routine when I walked home from the bus stop. In the 4 blocks between the corner where I hopped off the bus and my front door, I started to feel nauseous. It came on suddenly, without warning. I'd felt just fine all day, ate a lunch of Bosco sticks and marinara sauce, something I'd eaten hundreds of times throughout high school. Before I had an opportunity to consider alternative causes, I broke out in a cold sweat. Then I felt the curious flutter in my chest. My heart slipped into what I later learned was an episode of ventricular fibrillation. I became breathless and collapsed. What happened next has been told to me after the fact. I apparently sprawled in the road, where a woman driving a hatchback nearly crushed my skull beneath her tires. Instead, she screeched to a halt, tried to rouse me, then call emergency services when she doesn't. EMS arrived to discover my heart had stopped beating. I was dead, technically. They transported my body to the hospital, and somewhere along the way managed to shock my ticker back to life. Thus began a harrowing, weeks-long journey through the American healthcare system that led eventually to an ablation, pacemaker, and mountains of debt my family's still dealing with. But my heart's all right, and thank fuck it is, because what I learned that day has taught me never to thank God for anything. Because for those 6 minutes, as my lifeless body traveled across the city accompanied by 2 paramedics working tirelessly to revive me, my soul transcended our world to visit the hereafter. During my visit, I learned things about our universe that I wish I hadn't. Perhaps in sharing my story, I might help our species prepare for what comes after we expire. It began with light. Blinding, white, pervasive. It bathed me, calmed me. It was everything they tell you about. Beatific, welcoming, the stuff of spiritual experiences. I had the distinct feeling of ascent, like the light was lifting me skyward. I passed through several sets of gates, which my dizzied consciousness hardly registered. Upon reflection, I don't believe they were physical in any sense, and yet I recall the feeling of admittance, as if they might have prevented me from rising had they remained closed. In any event, I arrived in a place without dimension, a place beyond reality. It only made sense while I occupied it. I don't believe a corporeal being can make sense of the astral plane. Something about its intangible existence defies translation. So what I came away with were more impressions than images. I was not alone. Several life forces enclosed me upon my arrival. At first, because of my Christian upbringing, I believed them to be angels. In my incorporeal form, I made the spiritually equivalent gesture of opening my arms, anticipating their embrace. Instead, I felt myself shackled by their powers, like a collared dog. Humiliation and terror came over me. These were not the ethereal beings I'd been led to believe await us. These were cruel, unsympathetic overlords by whom I was fettered. Why? I thought, my soul wailing like a petulant child. Something like laughter returned, but it was cold, mocking. Thoughts floated into my consciousness like birds winging in and out of sight. They delivered some horrifying truths about existence that I'll do my best to relay to you now. Our universe, like many others running parallel to it, contains a pittance of the total energy in existence. It is a farm used to produce souls, which only arise in the precise conditions found in our cosmos. When you hear scientists talk about the improbability of the existence of our Goldilocks universe, it's because they don't actually come into being spontaneously. They're designed. And the hands that craft them are not benevolent gods, but rapacious beings with little care for the creatures they create. Our ultimate purpose, I learned in the custody of the spirits that shackled me, was to ripen until we were ready to serve them on their higher plane. The Big Bang gave birth to the universe to give rise to life to eventuate in humanity, a sufficiently conscious organism that may be harvested for use as slaves on a higher plane, where time and space dissolve into an eternity we spend in servitude. 6 minutes in heaven felt like a lifetime, which I spent amusing what I perceived to be a childlike spirit with a penchant for psychologically distressing manipulation. It batted me around like a cat with a caught mouse, reveling in the pain it produced. Physical discomforts we imagine hell inflicting upon us pale in comparison to the torture of soul pain. Loss of a loved one comes closest, that piercing emotional damage resulting from trauma. When it became clear my time had not yet expired on Earth and I was to return, I was told not to reveal their existence to the rest of my kind. My reward, they communicated to me, would be a marginally improved station among the slave population. Alternatively, if I managed to convince others of their existence, new horrors would await me when I returned. I can't imagine anything worse than what I experienced, subsumed beneath an ineffable grief and torment. For weeks, I tried to explain to anyone who would listen what I experienced. Everyone told me I'd suffered a very serious and traumatic experience for a young man, that the event left scars on my psyche as well as my heart. I gave up trying to convince them. I slowly began to convince myself that what they'd told me was true. I'd simply imagined it. A death dream, as it were. The mind reckoning with its own imminent demise, trying to make sense of the experience. Then I met someone who claimed to have met God. This was a few years later when the author of a non-fiction book recounting their near-death experience visited my hometown. I won't reveal the author's name as I don't want to invite a lawsuit, which I'm sure he'd launch against me if he read that I'd besmirched him. I attended a reading and afterward confronted him about his tale. I looked him in the eye and asked if he really met God, something I'm sure he's dealt with hundreds of times. He smiled and nodded, assuring me that yes, God is real and is filled with love. On a lark, I decided to tell him that I knew the truth, that slavery awaits us all. A flicker in his gaze betrayed his knowledge of the fact. He really had died and visited the afterlife, but lied about it in his book, because he knew. He knew the truth of heaven, the horrible place our souls are bound for. Don't talk to statues at the park. The park was a place my wife would have loved. She had a gift for finding art in the mundane. I started walking there in the evenings, months after she passed, not because I wanted to, but because sitting alone in our house, no, my house now, was unbearable. Silence pressed down like a physical weight, and her absence filled every room. The park, with its sprawling prairies, wooded trails, and scattered sculptures, offered no real solace, but I walked its paths anyway. It felt like something she might have done, marveling at the interplay of art and nature, pointing out details I would have missed. All I missed was her. Honestly, at first, I wasn't marveling at anything. I walked the gently curving path around the park because it was all I could do. Put one foot in front of the other, breathe in and out, and hope that someday the emptiness might lift. It didn't. There was one sculpture, though, that caught my attention and seemed to cut through my mental fog. It was a statue of a bronzed nude woman with disproportionately large hands and feet. She was perched high on a pedestal surrounded by wildflowers. Her back faced the path, her head tilted slightly upward as if gazing longingly at the horizon. She stood apart from the other sculptures in the park, all alone at the edge of a small field of prairie grass. As lonely and isolated as me. Her pose struck me, elegant but hesitant, like she wanted to retreat from the world but couldn't. She was weathered too. Streaks of green oxidation marred her smooth surface. Bird droppings dotted her head and shoulders, and cracks ran along the edges of her pedestal. I paused in front of her most evenings, not just because she was striking, but because she was something familiar in a world suddenly without guardrails. Like me, she seemed worn down by time, exposed to the elements, and yet still standing, waiting for something. God knows what. This is silly, and I'm embarrassed to admit it. But sometimes, no, often, in passing, I whispered, "Hello," under my breath. It felt ridiculous. I was ridiculous. But in the quiet of the park, it wasn't hard to imagine she might hear me, or at least that's what I told myself. The first time I noticed her head seemed to have moved, I laughed at myself. It wasn't possible. I wasn't that far gone. She was made of bronze, anchored to her pedestal. But over the following weeks, her pose shifted again. Each time I passed, her head seemed to turn slightly toward the path, her posture subtly different. I told myself it was nothing, a trick of the light or my imagination. But as I whispered my hellos, the subtle impression of change unsettled me. One evening, I stopped in front of her again, staring at her upturned face. "Hello?" I whispered softly, as was my custom. "Get out of the way, old man!" a voice suddenly shouted behind me. Startled and embarrassed, I turned just in time to see a young man on a bike speeding toward me. The wind of his passing tugged at my coat, and I stumbled backward, almost falling, barely avoiding him as he veered past. His mocking laughter trailed behind him as he disappeared down the path. My heart jumped in my chest and my face burned. It had been a close call. A jogger nearby glanced at me, and I noticed a family farther up the trail whispering to each other. I felt ridiculous. I could imagine how I looked to them. A senile old man, perverted in the way and ogling a nude statue. But for a moment I couldn't move. My face still flushed and heart beating rapidly, my gaze drifted back to the statue. From where I stood, I could see her profile and the edge of one blank, expressionless eye. Her presence pressed down on me, heavy and unrelenting as if she had witnessed my humiliation. The next day, I avoided the main path entirely and wandered into the woods. I followed a dirt trail I hadn't explored before. The quiet and the dappled shadows of the trees seemed welcoming, wrapping around me like a cocoon. That's when I saw them footprints. My breath caught, and my knees popped as I slowly crouched down to examine one of them. It was enormous, far too large and deep to be human. I examined them, squinting in the dusk. I could smell the freshly overturned earth, and one slightly trembling hand reached out and touched the bent and seemingly trampled grass. The tracks they couldn't be tracks led off the dirt trail, disappearing into the dense woods. Against my better judgment, I followed. The footprints, if that's what they were, ended in a small clearing. In its center lay a smashed bike, its frame mangled and twisted. Blood smeared the handlebars and pooled on the dirt beneath it. My stomach churned. I recognized the bike. It belonged to the young man who had nearly hit me. I staggered back, my mind racing. He must have crashed, I told myself. The footprints? An animal? The blood? Not as much as it looked. But even as I tried to convince myself, the air in the clearing felt wrong. The silence was now oppressive. The shadows were sinister. I turned and fled. When I reached the main trail, the statue loomed ahead. Her head seemed to have turned fully toward the path now. Her shoulders leaned forward, her posture expectant or predatory. I froze. Her blank eyes seemed to bore into me, unseeing yet impossibly aware. Unable to meet her eyes, my gaze darted downward. That's when I saw the stains. Dark, reddish-brown streaks covered her hands and feet, glistening in the fading light. Rust, I thought. Or paint. Metal creaked above me, and one of her hands seemed to move, the fingers slightly, ever so slightly, contracting, as if slowly forming a fist or gesturing for me to come closer. I forced myself to move, walking as quickly as I could manage back toward the parking lot without looking back. That night, I lay awake in a too-large bed staring at the ceiling. My mind kept returning to the smashed bike, the footprints, and her blank, unyielding stare. I woke the next morning to find 2 deep indentations in the mulch beneath my bedroom window. They were the same size and shape as the footprints in the woods. I grabbed a rake and smoothed over the marks, muttering excuses to myself. That night I dreamed of her. She stood next to my bed, her bronzed form gleaming in the moonlight. I couldn't move, couldn't even turn my head. But I felt her presence pressing down on me. Her blank eyes burned into me, cold, unfathomable, but wanting something. In my dream, I think I whispered a choked-out, "Hello," before spiraling into a deeper darkness. I woke gasping, freezing cold, with my heart pounding against my ribs. I sat and looked around wildly. In the dim morning light, I could see something at the foot of my bed. My shaking hand reached out and clawed at my glasses on my bedside table, knocking them to the floor in my haste. I reached down, put them on, and blinked rapidly to clear my eyes. I saw large, muddy footprints next to my bed and clumps of dirt scattered across the floor. I felt the thing at the foot of the bed move and shift, and I sat up straight, my heart in my mouth and my throat tight. With one shaking hand, I reached out and yanked the chain of my bedside lamp. It snapped on, dispelling the morning shadows and revealing what was shifting and moving at my feet. It was an upside-down bicycle helmet, rocking gently from the movement of my legs beneath the blankets. Cracked on one side and streaked with blood, the helmet overflowed with multicolored wildflowers in brilliant disarray: scarlet, gold, violet, some with black dirt still clinging stubbornly to their tangled roots. The flowers' tender petals, still trembling slightly, were speckled with blood and damp and shining with the early morning's dew. I found the real reason the Library of Alexandria was burned. I'd always been fascinated by ancient Egypt, not just the pyramids or the pharaohs, but the secrets, the rumors, stories of cursed tombs, hidden knowledge, and the fabled Library of Alexandria. So, when I had the chance to join a small archaeological dig near the city of Alexandria, I jumped on it like a moth to flame. It was my second week there when it happened. The lead archaeologist, Dr. Nassar, was busy cataloging what appeared to be fragments of a ruined temple. I, on the other hand, was in a cramped tunnel, deep underground, brushing dust off what I thought was another pottery shard. But when my flashlight caught the glint of something metallic, I froze. It wasn't a shard. It was a container. A small bronze cylinder, sealed with wax and inscribed with hieroglyphs. My heart raced as I carefully pried it open. Inside was a scroll. Not papyrus, but something else. Almost leathery, darkened with age, and covered in tiny, painstakingly inked symbols I didn't recognize. I brought it to the surface, expecting excitement from Dr. Nassar, but when he saw it, his face went pale. He muttered something in Arabic and refused to touch it. He told me to put it back where I found it. "Some things should stay buried," he warned, voice trembling. But I couldn't. Curiosity had me in its grip. That night, I smuggled the scroll back to my room. I spent hours trying to decipher it, cross-referencing ancient scripts, but nothing made sense. It wasn't hieroglyphs or Greek or anything I'd seen before. I was about to give up when the letters began, shifting. At first, I thought I was hallucinating from exhaustion. But no, the symbols were moving, rearranging themselves into English. It said, "Knowledge is a flame. It burns those who seek it unprepared." The room grew cold, unnaturally so, as I read on. It wasn't a historical text. It was a warning, a record of something the library had tried to contain, something so catastrophic that the scroll's writers had resorted to burning the entire place to the ground. The scroll spoke of them, not gods, not demons, something older, entities beyond comprehension, who existed in the void before creation. The library had been a fortress, a prison to hold their names, their true names, written in this script. The librarians had kept the knowledge locked away, knowing that merely knowing the names would give the entities a doorway into our reality. And then the scroll began to list those names. I didn't mean to read them. I swear I didn't. But the words pulled at my eyes, forcing me to follow the lines. My head throbbed, my vision darkened, and I felt like I was falling into the ink itself. The first name echoed in my mind like a thunderclap. The walls of my room began to bend and ripple as if they were made of water. Shadows moved in the corners, shadows that weren't cast by anything I could see. The second name filled me with dread so profound I couldn't breathe. I heard whispers then, voices that weren't my own, coming from nowhere and everywhere at once. By the third name, the shadows weren't just moving, they were watching, and they weren't alone. It called to me, and against all reason, I kept reading. The fourth name was like a blade carving into my thoughts. slicing away at the fragile walls of my sanity. And then, something new emerged from the shadows. Visions. Not dreams, not hallucinations. Memories. I saw the library as it was, before the fire. Grand halls stretched infinitely in every direction, lined with shelves that towered like the pyramids. Scholars moved about in quiet reverence, their faces lined with fear more than awe. This was not a place of learning. It was a prison. And in the heart of that prison, I saw him. Julius Caesar. But he wasn't the man I'd read about in history books. No conqueror, no statesman. He was afraid, trembling as he stood in the library's inner sanctum. His toga was stained with blood, not his own, and in his hands, he held this scroll. The librarians surrounded him, pleading in a language I couldn't understand. They were desperate to stop him, but it was too late. Caesar had already read a name. The walls of the sanctum rippled, just as my room had. Shadows began to move, but these were larger, darker, hungrier. Caesar stumbled back, dropping the scroll, his face pale and slick with sweat. "I didn't mean to," he stammered, his voice hollow. "I didn't." But the shadows didn't care. They surged forward, consuming one of the librarians in an instant. The man's scream was short-lived, cut off as his body disintegrated into ash. The rest of the scholars acted quickly, their fear overridden by purpose. They gathered scrolls, tomes, and artifacts, carrying them to a central pyre. One of them held a torch, but his hand shook. He hesitated, glancing at Caesar. "Do it!" the general shouted, his voice cracking. "Burn it all!" The librarian obeyed. The fire roared to life, consuming centuries of knowledge in seconds. The shadows recoiled, shrieking as the flames grew brighter. But it wasn't enough. The entity that Caesar had unleashed couldn't be undone so easily. It was already loose, spreading through the cracks of reality. The vision shifted then, snapping back to Caesar. I saw him years later, standing alone on the Ides of March, just before his assassination. He whispered something under his breath, a prayer or a curse, and for a moment I understood. The fire hadn't been enough. The thing he'd unleashed was still with him, haunting him, whispering its name. And now, it whispers to me. Not in words I can understand, but in feelings. Cold, suffocating dread. The kind that seeps into your bones and convinces you there's something watching, just out of sight. I've stopped turning on the lights at night. It doesn't matter anymore. The shadows are always there. Sometimes they move, shifting like they're alive, stretching long fingers toward me before recoiling as if they're savoring the weight. Last night, I thought I heard a voice. Not a whisper, but a single clear word spoken from the darkness behind me. A name. It wasn't one I recognized. Not from the scroll, not from the vision, not from anything I've ever heard. But the sound of it made my teeth ache and my heart falter. I don't know what it means. I don't want to. I burned everything I had from the dig. The notes, the photographs, even my clothes. It didn't help. Whatever I brought back wasn't the scroll. It's something else. Something I can't escape. I haven't slept in days. I'm afraid if I close my eyes, I'll hear the next name. Or worse, I'll see them. But the fire taught me something. Knowledge is a flame, yes, but it's also a chain. The more you learn, the tighter it binds you. And now I know just enough to be trapped forever. I think of Caesar, of the fire he started, and I understand why he failed. You can't destroy knowledge. You can only delay it. It wasn't just the scrolls or the names. It was the people who knew them. If I'm right, then there's only one way to end this. Only one way to stop the whispers before they reach someone else. The shadows are closer now, and I've already lit the match. Don't order anything from the Rag and Bone shop. The call came on a Wednesday night just after 9. I remember because the clock on my microwave blinked 9:03 in green LED lights when I heard my phone buzzing on the counter. I was halfway through reheating leftover pizza, a rare indulgence ever since I'd sworn off takeout in the name of self-improvement. Seeing her name on the screen sent something awful through me. I hadn't heard from Sophie in 3 days, not since our fight about, well, everything. Work, money, free time, faith. I didn't blame her for being tired of me. Most days I was tired of me too. I hesitated before answering. "Hey," I said, trying to sound casual. I tried acting as if I wasn't dreading that call. There was a pause. Not a good one. The kind where you know the person on the other end is carefully choosing their next words. "Hi, Michael," she finally said. Her voice sounded small, tired. "Can we talk?" My throat tightened. "Yeah, sure. What's up?" Another pause. Then she let out a single long exhale. "I can't do this anymore." The words hit me like a punch to the gut. "What do you mean? Sophie, come on, we can—" "Please don't," she interrupted. Her voice was cracking. "I've been trying to make this work for months, but it's always something, Michael. Every time I think we're okay, you slip." "I haven't had a drink in 137 days, I shot back, defensive. "I'm doing everything I can." "And that's great," she cut in again, her tone soft but firm. "But it's not just the drinking. It's the way you close yourself off. The way you push me away every time I try to help." "I'm trying," I said, my voice losing itself. "I love you." "I love you too," she said. And that was the worst part. Because I could hear the finality in her voice, the resignation. "But I'm not the one who can save you. You need a foundation that's stronger than I can be." I wanted to argue, to beg her to reconsider. Instead, I just stood there, gripping the phone like it was the only thing keeping me standing. "I hope you find peace, Michael," she said after a long silence. "I really do. I'll be praying for you to get the help you need." Then the line went dead. I don't remember hanging up. I don't remember the pizza burning in the microwave or the phone slipping out of my hand. What I do remember is standing in front of the cabinet above the fridge, my breath coming in shallow gasps as I stared at the unopened bottle of Jack Daniels I'd kept hidden, just in case I really needed it. My sponsor would have had a field day if he had seen me. "A safety net is just a noose with extra steps," he'd say. But I'd always been too afraid to get rid of it, just like I'd been too afraid to open it until now. My hand trembled as I reached for the bottle. The glass felt cool against my palm, almost soothing. I turned it over, the amber liquid sloshing inside. For a second, I thought about Sophie's voice, the way it cracked when she said goodbye. I thought about the 137 days I'd fought to claw my way out of the hole I'd spent years digging myself into. I thought of every prayer my AA group forced me to say, about every time Sophie had dragged me to church. I hated it all. I hated that I wasn't fixed. I hated that I didn't feel saved. I hated that. And then, something shifted. One second I was in my kitchen, staring down the edge of a decision I wasn't ready to make. The next I was sitting in a plush leather chair, the smell of cigar smoke and bourbon heavy in the air. The bottle was gone. The kitchen was gone. All around me was the hum of jazz and the low murmur of voices. I blinked, disoriented, and looked up. A man in a crisp black vest stood behind the bar, polishing a glass with slow, deliberate movements. He smiled when he saw me. "Rough night, Michael?" he asked, his voice smooth as silk. I opened my mouth to respond, but no words came out. How the hell did he know my name? The man behind the bar tilted his head slightly, his smile widening just enough to put me on edge. "Michael," he repeated, like it was the punchline to some private joke. "Welcome back to the Rag and Bone Shop." I looked around, trying to get my bearings. The walls were dark wood, polished to a near-mirror finish, and the room was dimly lit by a series of perfectly aligned lamps that casted long, flickering shadows. A faint jazz tune played from a record player in the corner, the needle crackling as it turned. The other patrons were scattered throughout the bar, sipping drinks or murmuring to each other in tones too low for me to make out. None of them looked at me. I didn't... My voice faltered. I cleared my throat, trying again. I didn't mean to come here. The bartender chuckled softly. Most people don't, he said, setting down the glass he'd been polishing. His hands were immaculate, not a speck of dirt or a crack in his manicured nails. But here you are. I was at home, I said, the words spilling out in a rush. In my kitchen. Had a bottle in your hand, he interrupted smoothly. Jack Daniels, if I'm not mistaken. An old friend of yours, isn't he? My stomach churned. How do you know that? He leaned forward, planting his elbows on the bar and resting his chin on his interlocked fingers. His eyes, dark and sharp, met mine, and for a moment I couldn't look away. Let's just say I know a man at a crossroads when I see one. I forced myself to break eye contact, glancing at the drink menu lying on the bar. There were no prices listed. My throat was dry, and I found myself licking my lips. I don't want a drink, I said firmly, pushing the menu away. Of course you don't, the bartender said, his tone friendly but condescending, like he was humoring a child. You're just here to... What? Soak up the ambiance? I stood up, the stool scraping against the floor. I'm leaving. The bartender didn't move, but his smile widened. You're free to try, he said, but you might find the door harder to reach than you think. I turned toward the entrance, my heart pounding. The door wasn't far, just a few steps, but as I started walking, the distance seemed to stretch. Each step I took felt slower, heavier, like wading through thick honey. Why are you in such a rush? The bartender called after me. Sit down, Michael. Have a drink. Take the edge off. God knows you've earned it. I didn't stop, didn't look back. The door was right there, just a few more steps. Then I heard the sound of glass clinking against wood, and my feet froze. Do you remember the first time you drank? The bartender asked. I bet you do. Everyone remembers their first. That warm rush in your chest, the way the world seemed to tilt in your favor for once. I turned my head slightly, just enough to see him out of the corner of my eye. He was leaning casually against the bar, holding a tumbler of amber liquid. The ice cubes clinked softly as he swirled the glass. Do you remember the way it felt, Michael? To let go of everything for just a little while. Shut up, I said, my voice shaking. He ignored me, taking a slow sip from the glass and savoring it like it was the finest thing he'd ever tasted. That's the thing about alcohol, isn't it? It's a liar, a cheat, but God, does it know how to make you feel alive. I turned fully to face him, my anger outweighing my fear for the first time. I said I'm not drinking. I don't want anything from you. The bartender smirked, setting the glass down with a deliberate clink. We'll see, he said. For the first time, I noticed the other patrons watching me. Their faces were pale and expressionless, their eyes glassy. The bartender snapped his fingers to get my attention, then gestured toward an empty stool. Sit down, Michael, let's talk. No pressure, no obligations. Just you, me, and a little perspective. I felt my legs move on their own. I returned to a seat in front of him. He raised an eyebrow, his expression amused. There we go, he said. He reached beneath the bar and produced a small, familiar object, a silver flask engraved with my initials. My chest tightened. I hadn't seen that flask in years, not since I'd thrown it into the river after my first stint in rehab. How? It has a way of finding its way back to you, the bartender said, his smile sharp as a knife. Funny how that works, isn't it? I stared at the flask, my mind racing. The door behind us opened, letting in a blast of cold air. Who's the handsome man? A soft, feminine voice asked. I turned to see her. She was beautiful. She stepped into the bar like she'd been there all along, the kind of beauty that stretched beyond her looks but into the way she carried herself. Her dress shimmered faintly in the low light, hugging her figure. Dark hair spilled over her shoulders, and her red lips curled into a smile that could stop a heart mid-beat. She already held a martini glass in one hand, the liquid inside catching the light like liquid gold. Her eyes locked on mine, and for a moment, it felt like the room had gone completely silent. "You must be Michael," she said, her voice smooth and inviting. "How do you know my name?" I asked, softly. She laughed, the sound like wind chimes caught in a summer breeze. "Everyone knows your name here. You're the guest of honor." The bartender chuckled behind me, the sound low and amused. "Let me introduce you to Lydia. She's a connoisseur of sorts." The woman Lydia moved closer, her heels clicking softly against the floor. "You look like you could use a drink," she said, holding out the martini glass to me. "It's just one. No one's counting here." I shook my head. "I don't want a drink." "Don't want," she repeated, her tone light, almost teasing. "Or don't trust yourself to take just one." Her words hit like a slap. I opened my mouth to respond, but nothing came out. She smiled, sensing my hesitation, and took a seat next to mine. "Michael," she said softly, her voice dropping to a breath. "You're hurting. I can see it in your eyes, the guilt, the pain, the weight of it all. Don't you want to let it go? Just for a little while?" Her words dripped with sympathy, but there was something behind them, something cold and calculating. "I'm fine," I said, though the pain in my voice betrayed me. "You don't look fine," Lydia replied. She held the martini glass closer, the golden liquid rippling slightly. "This will help. Just one sip. You deserve that much, don't you?" My pulse was pounding in my ears and the room felt like it was closing in. "Listen to her, Michael," the bartender said, his voice like velvet. "She's offering you a way out, a little relief from all that pain you carry around. Let's be honest here, you're not a saint after all." My eyes lingered on the drink in Lydia's hand. Lydia tilted her head, studying me with those impossibly sharp eyes. "You're not doing this for her, are you? That girl who just left you, what was her name? Sophie?" The mention of her name hit me hard. "Leave her out of this." "Why?" Lydia asked, her voice dripping with faux innocence. "You think she's suffering the way you are? No, Michael, she's fine. She's probably asleep right now, dreaming of a life without you in it." "Shut up," I snapped. My voice barely sounded like my own. She didn't flinch. "I'm just being honest. You've been trying to fix yourself for her, haven't you? But now she's gone, and you're still here, still broken." Her words burrowed into my chest like shards of glass. I looked away, staring at the floor, but the sound of the martini glass being set down on the bar made my head snap back up. Lydia's smile widened. "You don't have to be broken, Michael," she said. "Not tonight. Not with us." I could feel the bartender watching me, his presence oppressive and inescapable. My eyes flicked to the drink on the table, then back to Lydia. "I shouldn't," I muttered, though it felt like the word was being ripped out of me. Her expression softened, her voice turning gentle. "It's okay to be weak, you know." She leaned in even closer, so close I could smell her perfume, something sweet but cloying, like honeyed flowers. My resolution felt like it was physically wavering in my heart. I could see my reflection in her eyes, distorted and empty. "Don't make this harder than it needs to be," Lydia whispered. I closed my eyes, forcing the image of her out of my head. Sophie's voice echoed in my mind, faint but clear. "I hope you find peace, Michael." Somehow I found the strength to stand up and take a step toward the door. Then another. "I'm leaving," I said, louder this time. Lydia's smile faltered for the first time. "You're making a mistake," she said, her voice cold and sharp. I didn't respond. The bar didn't expand this time. I reached the exit. My hand reached for the doorknob, my heart pounding. My fingers brushed the cold metal, and for a moment I thought I'd made it. Just one turn, one pull, and I'd be free of this place. But before I could twist it, the bartender's voice stopped me cold. "You really think you're leaving?" It wasn't the words that froze me. It was the tone. Gone was the silkiness, the easy charm. His voice was vicious now, colder, with an edge that scraped against my nerves. I didn't turn around. "Yes," I replied, though I found my feet rooted to the floor. "Of course you are," he said, almost laughing. "But before you go, maybe you'd like to see what you're returning to." Something clinked behind me. Against my better judgment, I glanced over my shoulder. The bartender still stood behind the bar, but his posture had shifted. He wasn't relaxed anymore. His hands were braced on the counter, his grin stretched just a fraction too wide, teeth unnaturally white against the dim light. He gestured toward the corner of the room where an old television sat on a metal cart. I hadn't noticed it before. The screen flickered to life, casting a cold, bluish glow over the bar. Static buzzed and cracked, but after a moment, the image sharpened. At first, I didn't understand what I was looking at. It was a room, messy, familiar. The lighting was dim, and broken furniture littered the floor. A man sat slouched on a couch, his head tilted back, a bottle of whiskey dangling from his fingers. It took me a second to realize it was me. "What the hell is this?" I demanded, my voice betraying me. The bartender didn't answer, his grin widening as the scene on the TV shifted. The me on the screen leaned forward, taking a long swig from the bottle. His movements were sluggish, almost puppet-like. He muttered something unintelligible, then staggered to his feet, knocking over a lamp. "Stop it," I said, louder this time. The bartender tilted his head. "Stop what? This is just reality, Michael. The life you're so desperate to return to." The TV flickered again, showing me stumbling down a dimly lit street. My clothes were disheveled, my face pale and gaunt. I shouted something at a group of strangers, my words slurred and incoherent. They walked away quickly, not even sparing me a second glance. "That's not me," I said, but the words felt hollow even as I said them. "Oh, but it is," the bartender said, his voice dripping with false sympathy. "This is where you are, Michael. Right now. This is what you're doing." The scene shifted again. This time I was in a dingy bar, surrounded by people who looked just as lost as I did. A woman leaned close to me, her lipstick smudged, her eyes glassy. I laughed at something she said, then downed another shot. The sound of ice clinking against glass pulled my attention back to the bartender. He held up a drink, the amber liquid catching the light. "This is what you want, isn't it? The warmth, the numbness, the escape." I turned back to the TV, my stomach twisting. The images felt too vivid, too real. I could almost feel the burn of the whiskey, the weight of the emptiness that followed. The bartender's voice softened again, almost kind. "Do you see it now, Michael? The futility of fighting it? You're already there. You've already made the choice. This place?" He gestured to the bar around us. "It's just a courtesy, a little limbo to ease the transition." "No," I said, my voice barely audible. "I'm not doing that. I'm not drinking." The bartender chuckled, setting the glass down with a deliberate clink. "Oh, Michael, you're holding the bottle right now. Do you think you're still standing in your kitchen staring at it, debating? Number, you've already opened it. You've already taken that first drink." I shook my head, stepping back toward the door. My heart was pounding, my chest tight. "You're lying." "Am I?" he asked, his tone almost playful. "Or are you lying to yourself?" The TV crackled again, the screen filling with static before cutting to another scene. This time, it was Sophie. She was sitting in a brightly lit cafe, her phone in her hand. Her face was tense, her lips pressed into a thin line. She was talking to someone, a friend, maybe. Maybe someone more. The bartender's grin faded slightly, his tone turning serious. "She's already moving on, Michael. You can't undo what you've done. You can't fix it. But you can stop running from the truth." I clenched my fists, my nails digging into my palms. "What do you want from me?" The bartender's smile returned. "I want you to accept who you are. Stop pretending you're something you're not. Sit down, have a drink, and let it all go. My back pressed against the door, the weight of his words, the images on the screen. The sound of Lydia's quiet laughter, it all pressed down on me like a crushing wave. "You're fighting so hard," the bartender said, his tone calm, almost soothing. "But for what? What's waiting for you out there, Michael? More of the same. You think you're strong enough to face it, but we both know you're not." I shook my head, swallowing the lump in my throat. "You don't know me." He smirked, tilting his head slightly. "Don't I? I've been with you every step of the way. Every time you reached for a drink, every time you told yourself it was the last one. I was there when you made those promises, and I was there when you broke them. I'm not that person anymore." The bartender chuckled, low and deep, as if I'd said something amusing. "You keep telling yourself that, but you don't believe it, do you?" He gestured to the TV, where the version of me on the screen stumbled out of the bar, laughing loudly with the woman from before. "This is who you are, Michael. This is where you belong." "Stop it!" I shouted, the words echoing through the room. The other patrons turned to look at me again, their faces pale and blank, no life, no soul, just empty vessels. They stared for a moment, then slowly turned back to their drinks. "You can yell all you want," Lydia said, her voice soft and sweet. "It doesn't change anything. He's right. You've already made your choice." I turned to face her. She was leaning casually against the bar, a new drink in her hand, her eyes glittering with malice. "I haven't made any choice," I said through gritted teeth. "Haven't you?" she asked, arching an eyebrow. "Then why are you here? Why did you come to us?" "I didn't," I started, but she cut me off. "Of course you did," she said, taking a slow sip of her drink. "You were standing in your kitchen with that bottle in your hand, and you called out. You wanted someone to tell you it was okay, that it wasn't your fault, and here we are." I shook my head, backing further into the door. "Number, I didn't want this." The bartender leaned against the counter, his grin widening. "Denial is a funny thing, isn't it? You've spent your whole life running from the truth, Michael, from the things you've done, the people you've hurt. But deep down, you know there's no escaping it. There's no forgiveness for you." His words cut deeper than I wanted to admit. My mind flashed with images: Sophie's tear-streaked face, my mother's disappointment when I missed yet another family dinner, the countless nights I'd spent drowning in a bottle instead of facing my problems. I felt the guilt clawing at my chest, threatening to pull me under. "Stop," I whispered, barely audible. "What was that?" the bartender asked, cupping his ear in mock confusion. "Did you say something?" "I said stop," I shouted. He laughed, a sound that seemed to echo from everywhere at once. "You can't stop this, Michael. This is you. This is all you've ever been, and all you'll ever be." My legs gave out, and I slid down the door, my hands trembling as I gripped my head. The images on the TV blurred together, a sickening montage of my worst moments. I could hear Lydia's voice in my ear, soft and taunting. "You can't fight it," she said. "Why would you even want to? The world out there doesn't care about you. No one's waiting for you. No one's coming to save you. But here, we can make it all go away." I looked up at her, my vision blurry with tears. "Why are you doing this?" She crouched down in front of me, her smile as sharp as a blade. "Because it's what you want, Michael. Deep down you know it is." The bartender stepped closer, holding out the tumbler of whiskey. "One drink," he said, his voice low and persuasive. "That's all it takes. One drink, and all this pain goes away." I stared at the glass, the amber liquid swirling like a storm. My hands itched to reach for it, to take it and make everything stop. But then Sophie's voice echoed in my mind again. "I hope you find peace, Michael." "Michael," the bartender said softly, holding the tumbler closer, the amber liquid catching the dim, flickering light. "This isn't defeat. This isn't failure, it's mercy. You've carried enough. Why not let it go? His words slithered into my mind, each one heavier than the last. My gaze flicked to the glass, then back to his face. His grin was still there, but now it was sharper, less human. Lydia's voice floated in behind him, quiet and piercing. "Listen to him," she cooed. "What do you have to lose? It's just one drink. It's not like anyone will notice." My fists tightened against my knees. My chest felt like it was caving in, my breath coming shallow and fast. The TV behind them still showed scenes from my life, the drunk me, the careless me, the cruel me. "I don't want this," I muttered, barely audible. "What was that?" the bartender asked, leaning closer. "I don't want this," I repeated louder this time. My voice cracked, but I didn't care. I looked up at him, the glass shaking in his hand now. "You want me weak. You want me broken. That's all you've ever wanted." His grin faltered just for a second. It was small, barely noticeable, but I saw it. Lydia straightened from where she was leaning, her smile fading as her eyes narrowed. "Be careful, Michael," she said. "You're treading dangerous ground." I pushed myself up from the door, my legs shaking but holding me steady. "You don't want to help me," I said, my voice growing stronger with each word. "You want me to give up. You want me to believe this is all I am." The bartender's grin returned, but it was tighter now, less confident. "And what else are you, Michael? Look at yourself." He gestured to the TV, where my drunken double stumbled and slurred. "You think you're better than this? You think you're strong enough to fight it?" I took a step forward, my fists still clenched. "I know I'm not strong enough," I admitted, my voice raw. "But I know one other thing: I've still got faith. Even if that's the last gift Sophie ever gives me. I'm not who I was before I met her." Lydia's smile twisted into a snarl, her perfect features warping into something cruel and inhuman. "You think you can run from this, from us?" The bartender slammed the glass onto the counter, his grin finally cracking into something darker, his teeth impossibly sharp. "We're not some dream you can just wake up from, Michael. We're you. We're in you." My heart pounded in my chest as I reached for the doorknob again, my hand shaking. Lydia and the bartender moved closer, their once human appearances flickering, distorting like a bad signal. The air grew colder, the room darker as their voices layered over each other, a cacophony of accusations and temptations. "You're nothing without us. You'll fail, just like before. No one's waiting for you out there. You belong to us." I shut my eyes, gripping the doorknob so tightly my knuckles ached. Sophie's voice echoed in my mind again, faint but steady. "I hope you find peace, Michael." With a deep breath, I turned the knob and yanked the door open. The cold night air hit me like a slap, sharp and bracing. Behind me, the noise surged, their voices rising to a deafening crescendo. I fell backwards. "Don't you leave us!" Lydia screamed, her voice warped and guttural. "You'll come back," the bartender roared. The sound of their shouts and laughter followed me, growing fainter with each second I dropped. And then, suddenly, it was gone. The night was silent except for my ragged breathing. I was standing in the middle of my kitchen, the door to the bar nowhere in sight. The bottle of whiskey was still in my hand, its cap still screwed tight. For a moment, I just stood there. My reflection in the glass was distorted, my face pale and drawn. My thumb brushed the label, and for the first time I didn't feel the pull. I set the bottle down on the counter and turned away, my legs weak but steady. The cold air still lingered on my skin, a faint reminder of where I'd been and what I'd faced. Almost every night I can still hear the sounds of that bar in my head. I can still hear the bartender coaching me forward. But I know I'm not the only one saying no. I'm not the only one putting up a fight. The devil's going to call us all to his rag and bone shop, but just keep saying no. Whatever you order from that bar is going to follow you to the grave.